They spent months telling you Shedeur Sanders was arrogant, that he threw teammates under the bus, that he was immature, selfish, and only cared about himself. But one moment, barely acknowledged by the national media, quietly shattered that entire narrative. When Shedeur was forced out of the game, the stadium didn't go silent. Fans booed, loudly. And when Dillon Gabriel stepped in, the boos didn't stop. It was uncomfortable, awkward. The kind of moment most players would avoid addressing altogether, but Shedeur didn't dodge it. Instead, he did something nobody expected. Without being asked, without being prompted, Shedeur publicly apologized to Gabriel. He made it clear he never wanted to put his teammate in that situation. He acknowledged how difficult it is to come in cold, without reps, without rhythm, and without support. No deflection, no ego, just accountability and empathy. And that's where the story cracks wide open. Because this is the same player fans were told was divisive. The same quarterback labeled a locker room problem. The same guy some said couldn't lead an NFL team. Yet when the moment called for self-preservation, Shedeur chose selflessness instead. That doesn't fit the narrative, and that's exactly why it didn't get pushed. Week after week, the focus stays glued to box scores, completion percentages, side-by-side stat comparisons. But what keeps slipping through the cracks is the unquantifiable stuff. The way teammates respond, the way the crowd reacts, the way a young quarterback carries himself when everything around him is unstable. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Narratives don't fall apart because of big speeches. They fall apart because of small, undeniable moments that don't align with the story being sold. This was one of those moments. Because arrogant players don't apologize for situations they didn't create. Divisive leaders don't publicly defend teammates they're supposedly competing against. And immature quarterbacks don't understand how words can either divide a locker room or hold it together. So before we even talk about stats, schemes, or wins and losses, there's a bigger question that needs answering. If Shedeur Sanders keeps showing you who he is, why are so many people still pretending he's someone else? And once you start pulling on that thread, everything else starts to unravel. It happened fast, and most people almost missed it. But if you were paying attention, this was the moment that changed everything. When Shedeur Sanders was taken out of the game, the reaction inside the stadium was immediate and emotional. Booing poured down from the stands, not because fans hated him, but because they didn't want him to leave the field. And when Dillon Gabriel stepped in, those boos followed. Loud, uncomfortable, the kind of moment that creates tension instantly. This is usually where narratives explode. Fans online rushed to frame it as proof of division. Media voices hinted at locker room friction. Some even tried to spin it as Shedeur being the center of controversy again. But then came the part nobody expected, and almost nobody highlighted. After the game, Shedeur wasn't asked about Dillon Gabriel. He wasn't prompted. He wasn't cornered by reporters, yet he brought it up anyway, on his own, calmly. He explained that he felt bad putting Dillon in that position. He talked about how difficult it is to come into a game cold, without reps, without rhythm, and without preparation. He made it clear he never wanted that moment to fall on his teammate. That single decision mattered more than any stat line. Because in a league where quarterbacks are taught to protect themselves first, physically and politically, Shedeur chose empathy. He didn't redirect the spotlight. He didn't distance himself. He didn't pretend it wasn't awkward. He owned the moment and tried to soften it for someone else. And that doesn't align with the image people have been pushing. This is the same player critics have labeled arrogant, the same quarterback accused of being selfish, the same guy said to divide fan buses and locker rooms. Yet here he was, actively trying to reduce tension instead of feeding it, trying to bring unity instead of separation. Even more telling was what he didn't say. He didn't complain about the boos. He didn't criticize fans. He didn't use the moment to elevate himself. He framed it as a team issue and a human one. Moments like this don't show up on highlight reels. They don't get logged on stat sheets, but they're the moments teammates remember. They're the moments that quietly reshape how a player is viewed inside a building. And that's why this mattered so much. Because if the narrative around Shedeur Sanders were true, this moment never happens. He stays silent. He lets the tension grow. He moves on. Instead, he leaned into leadership, when it would have been easier not to. And once that happened, it forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Maybe the version of Shedeur Sanders that's been talked about for months doesn't actually exist. And that realization opened the door to a much bigger conversation. For months, the story around Shedeur Sanders was already written before he ever got a fair chance to define himself. Arrogant, immature, divisive, a celebrity quarterback who supposedly cared more about attention than football. Those labels followed him from college straight into the NFL, repeated so often that many people accepted them as fact. But when you line that narrative up against reality, the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. Because nothing about Shedeur's actual behavior matches the image that's been pushed. Week after week, when things go wrong on the field, he refuses to shift blame. He doesn't point fingers at protection. He doesn't complain about play calling. He doesn't call out receivers for drops or missed routes. Instead, he internalizes responsibility, even when the circumstances clearly aren't on him. That's not arrogance, that's restraint. The reality is that Shedeur consistently does the opposite of what critics claim. He speaks carefully. He praises teammates. He defends coaches, even when fans and media are openly questioning decisions. He avoids controversy in interviews, even when he'd be justified in expressing frustration. And most importantly, he understands how quickly words can divide a locker room. That awareness is rare, especially for a young quarterback under constant scrutiny. What's even more revealing is how the narrative shifts depending on who's being discussed. When Shedeur struggles statistically, context disappears. Pressure, drops, and chaos get ignored. But when others struggle, explanations suddenly matter. Development takes time. Circumstances are considered. Patience is encouraged. That double standard fuels frustration among fans who are actually watching the games. There's also an uncomfortable truth about why this narrative stuck in the first place. Shedeur entered the league with confidence. He speaks clearly. He doesn't shrink in front of cameras. For some, that confidence gets misread as ego, especially when it doesn't fit the mold they're comfortable with. But confidence isn't immaturity, and composure under fire isn't selfishness. If anything, the past few weeks have shown that Shedeur is hyper-aware of how his words and actions are perceived. He chooses unity over ego, silence over drama, growth over validation, and that's exactly why the old labels feel outdated. The more he plays, the harder it becomes to reconcile the narrative with what's actually happening. Teammates aren't pushing back. Coaches aren't distancing themselves. The locker room isn't fracturing. If anything, respect appears to be growing quietly, the kind that doesn't need headlines. And that's the real tension here. Because once reality keeps contradicting the narrative, one of them has to give. And the longer Shedeur continues to act the way he has, the harder it becomes to sell the version of him that never seems to show up on Sundays or at the podium. Which raises the next question. If the narrative is wrong, why is it still being pushed so hard? If you're judging Shedeur Sanders strictly by the box score, you're missing the most important part of his development. And that's exactly where so many conversations go wrong. The stat line doesn't show pocket discipline. It doesn't show decision speed. It doesn't show when a quarterback chooses the boring play instead of forcing a highlight. But when you actually watch the tape, those details jump off the screen, and they tell a very different story than the numbers scrolling across the bottom of the broadcast. Over the last several games, Sanders has clearly adjusted how he's playing the position. Early on, you could see him trying to do too much, holding the ball, waiting for something big to open up. That's normal for a young quarterback who wants to win immediately. But recently, that mentality has shifted. He's stepping up into the pocket instead of drifting backward. He's taking checkdowns instead of forcing throws. He's using his legs strategically, not to escape chaos, but to extend drives. Those are quiet wins. When protection breaks down, and it often does, Sanders isn't panicking. He's identifying where pressure is coming from and getting the ball out. Sometimes that means a 3-yard completion on 3rd down instead of a risky shot. Sometimes it means throwing the ball away. Those decisions don't trend on social media, but they keep an offense functional. And here's the part critics ignore. Growth like this usually comes after quarterbacks get burned for mistakes. Sanders is adjusting in real time under fire without a stable environment. That's not easy. Many young quarterbacks don't make those adjustments until year 2 or 3, if they ever do. Another thing the box score doesn't capture is how the team responds. The offense moves differently when Sanders is in rhythm. Drives stay alive longer. First downs come from improvisation and awareness, not just play design. Teammates feed off that. You can see it in how players rally after completions or first down scrambles. None of that shows up in completion percentage. There's also context that numbers can't provide. Throwing into tight windows because routes haven't fully developed. Delivering passes with defenders already closing. Making correct reads that still result in incompletions because of drops or disrupted timing. Those plays count the same statistically as bad decisions, but they aren't the same at all. This is why evaluators stress film over stats, especially early in a quarterback's career. And on film, Sanders is doing exactly what you want to see from a young player learning the NFL on the fly. Simplifying the game, protecting the football, and stacking small improvements. He's not perfect. Nobody is claiming that, but improvement isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like fewer negative plays, quicker decisions, smarter risk management. And that kind of growth doesn't show up in the box score, but it shows up everywhere else that actually matters. At some point, fans started noticing something wasn't adding up, not on the field, but in the way the story was being told. Because the conversation around Shedeur Sanders kept circling the same surface-level points, even as the reality on Sundays looked far more complicated. The questions rarely changed. Completion percentage, box score comparisons. Is he doing enough? And on their own, those are fair things to ask. But what made the coverage feel off was what wasn't being asked with the same energy. Where were the questions about protection, about route timing, about offensive cohesion, about why a rookie quarterback was being evaluated in isolation while everything around him was clearly unstable? That imbalance is where frustration set in. When Sanders makes a conservative throw, it's framed as hesitation. When he takes a checkdown, it's framed as a lack of aggression. But when he forces a throw, it's suddenly proof he's reckless. There's no winning in that framing. The context disappears, and every decision gets judged without acknowledging the circumstances forcing those decisions. Meanwhile, similar struggles from other young quarterbacks around the league are treated differently. Developmental curve, bad supporting cast, coaching transitions. Those explanations exist, just not consistently here, and fans aren't blind to that contrast. Local coverage hasn't helped either. Outlets like ESPN Cleveland have openly questioned whether Sanders is someone you build around, even while admitting the system itself looks undefined. That's a strange place to land. If the offense lacks identity, timing, and protection, how can any quarterback be fairly judged inside it? It creates a moving target. What's made things worse is how moments get amplified or ignored depending on who they favor. A bad throw becomes a headline. A smart decision under pressure barely gets mentioned. A leadership moment, like Sanders defending teammates or discouraging divisive questions, fades almost instantly from the conversation. That selective attention shapes perception more than performance ever could. And here's the deeper issue. Once media framing locks in early, it's hard to undo. Every future game gets filtered through that lens. Mistakes confirm the narrative. Improvements get minimized. Progress gets labeled not enough. It's not always intentional, but it's powerful. Fans who actually watch the games feel that disconnect the most. They see a quarterback adjusting, learning, and leading, while the coverage feels stuck replaying old assumptions. That gap is why trust in the narrative is eroding. Because when the analysis feels predetermined, people stop listening. And once that happens, the conversation shifts from, "Is he improving?" to, "Why does it feel like some people don't want him to?" That question, fair or not, is now part of the discourse. And it didn't come from hype, it came from inconsistency. Which is why this focus feels off, and why more fans are starting to push back. If there were real problems behind the scenes, if Shedeur Sanders were truly the divisive figure some have tried to paint him as, you'd expect to hear it first from the people in the locker room. And yet, when you actually listen to his teammates, the story sounds completely different. Over and over, players around Shedeur speak about him with respect, not forced praise, not media-trained sunbutt, but genuine acknowledgement of how he carries himself. When receivers make mistakes, he doesn't call them out publicly. When plays break down, he absorbs the criticism himself. That kind of behavior doesn't go unnoticed inside a building, especially in the NFL, where trust between a quarterback and his teammates is everything. Look at how he handled situations involving dropped passes or missed assignments. Instead of frustration, he's consistently been quick to defend guys like Shedeur, brushing off mistakes and reinforcing confidence. That's not just good leadership. That's how you keep a locker room from fracturing during tough stretches. The same tone shows up with fellow rookies. When injuries hit, Sanders is often one of the first voices expressing support. Teammates like Quinchon Judkins and Harold Fenunja have spoken openly about unity, resilience, and trust within the group. Those comments matter because they're coming from players living the grind with him every day, not from analysts watching film in isolation. What's especially telling is how players respond to divisive questions. When reporters attempt to pit quarterbacks against each other or stir controversy, Sanders shuts it down immediately. He's openly said those questions hurt the team. He's made it clear that framing teammates as rivals instead of partners creates unnecessary separation. That's a quarterback thinking beyond himself, thinking about the health of the entire roster. And then there's the crowd reaction. Fans don't boo quarterbacks they've turned against. They boo because they care. The reaction when Sanders left the game wasn't rejection. It was frustration at losing the player they believe gives them the best chance to compete. That kind of emotional response usually mirrors what's happening inside the building. If teammates didn't believe in him, you'd see it in body language, in effort, in post-game comments. But that hasn't happened. Instead, you see players rally. You hear consistent support. You see younger guys feeding off his energy and veterans appreciating his professionalism. That doesn't mean everything is perfect. No locker room ever is. But the idea that Shedeur is some disruptive presence simply doesn't align with what his teammates keep showing and saying. And that's the problem for the narrative. Because it's one thing to debate stats or scheme. It's another to ignore the people closest to the situation. When teammates consistently tell a different story, eventually that story becomes harder to dismiss. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, if the locker room believes in him, why does anyone else think they know better? At this point, the labels attached to Shedeur Sanders are starting to collapse under their own weight, not because of a viral clip or a loud rebuttal, but because his behavior keeps quietly contradicting everything that's been said about him. Arrogant players don't speak the way Shedeur does after losses. They don't talk about process. They don't talk about patience. They don't emphasize taking what the defense gives them and stacking plays instead of chasing glory. Yet that's exactly how he frames his mindset. Over and over, he comes back to the same theme, slowing the game down, staying disciplined and focusing on the next rep instead of the noise around him. That matters because immaturity usually shows up when things go wrong. When pressure mounts, immature quarterbacks rush decisions. They press. They try to win the game in one throw. But what you're seeing from Shedeur is the opposite. He's openly admitting that earlier in the season he tried to do too much, and he's explaining in real time how he's correcting that. That level of self-awareness isn't common, especially in a league where young players are constantly told to project confidence at all costs. The other reason the label won't stick is consistency. Week after week, his tone stays the same. Wins don't inflate it. Losses don't break it. He doesn't oscillate between bravado and defensiveness. He stays even. And consistency is the fastest way to expose a false narrative because fake personas crack under pressure. There's also the context people keep skipping over. Shedeur isn't operating in a smooth, veteran-led offense. He's surrounded by rookies, injuries, and constant change. Yet instead of using that as cover, he treats it as responsibility. He talks about growing together, about learning together, about staying aligned mentally. That's leadership language, not branding. And then there's the simplest reason the label won't stick. Actions scale louder than opinions. Defending teammates, shutting down divisive questions, refusing to feed controversy, supporting injured rookies. None of that is accidental, and none of it benefits him individually in the short term. If anything, it exposes him to more criticism for not being aggressive enough in interviews. But long-term, those actions build credibility. Inside the Cleveland Browns building, that credibility matters more than outside chatter. Players don't rally around headlines. They rally around consistency, trust, and how someone shows up when things aren't pretty. That's why this narrative is running out of room. You can repeat a label for only so long before reality keeps interrupting it. And with Shedeur, reality keeps showing the same thing. A quarterback who wants to win, who's learning on the fly, and who understands that leadership isn't loud, it's steady. The label doesn't stick because the evidence doesn't support it anymore. And the longer he keeps operating this way, the harder it becomes to pretend otherwise. At some point, narratives either evolve or they collapse, and the story surrounding Shedeur Sanders is reaching that breaking point. For months, people were told who Shedeur was supposed to be: loud, arrogant, divisive, not a real leader. But when you line that story up against what's actually happening on the field in interviews and inside the locker room, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. The words don't match the actions. The accusations don't match the evidence. What stands out most isn't one throw, one game, or one stat line. It's the consistency. The way Shedeur responds when things go wrong. The way he deflects praise and absorbs blame. The way he shuts down questions that try to pit teammates against each other. The way he talks about growth like it's a responsibility, not a buzzword. Those patterns matter far more than any hot take. And here's the uncomfortable truth some people don't want to confront. If Shedeur looked the way critics claim he does, it would have shown by now. Locker rooms don't hide fractures. Teammates don't fake respect week after week. Players don't rally around someone who undermines them. Yet what keeps surfacing is unity, especially among young players navigating the same chaos together. That doesn't mean Shedeur is perfect. It doesn't mean he's above criticism. Development is still happening. Mistakes are still there. But the conversation was never really about perfection. It was about character. And on that front, the accusations are running out of oxygen. What makes this moment so important is that it forces a choice, not for Shedeur, but for everyone watching. Do you keep clinging to a narrative built on assumptions, or do you adjust when the evidence changes? Because growth isn't just something quarterbacks are asked to show. It applies to how stories are told, too. Inside the Cleveland Browns, this season has been messy. Injuries, instability, questions everywhere. Yet through it all, Shedeur has remained steady. Not loud, not defensive, steady. And that steadiness is starting to speak louder than the noise around him. So maybe the real takeaway isn't whether Shedeur Sanders is the future. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe the real question is this: if a player keeps showing you who he is through his words, his growth, and his leadership, how long does it take before the story finally catches up to reality? Because the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to deny what's right in front of us. And once that happens, the narrative doesn't just change. It gets rewritten.